there is a body of cold, grey water sitting between England, Denmark and the Netherlands that most people cross quickly and think about rarely. They fly over it, sail through it, or glance at it on a map as though it was simply empty space, a gap between more interesting places. But that reading gets everything backwards. The North Sea is not the gap between the story. The North Sea is the story. This is the water that shaped the English language, funded Dutch prosperity, launched Viking fleets, and powered industrial Britain. It swallowed a world before anyone had a name for it, then gave rise to kingdoms, trade empires, and naval dynasties that wrote the rules of the modern world. The nations lining its shores did not merely live beside it. They were made by it, broken by it, and in many cases defined by their relationship to it for thousands of years. Understanding England, Denmark and the Netherlands without understanding this sea is like trying to understand a person while ignoring everything that ever happened to them. So what exactly did this sea do, and how did it do it? That is the question at the heart of this history, and the answer reaches back far further than most people expect, to a time before the North Sea existed at all. Right now, beneath roughly 500 feet of cold Atlantic water, there is a landscape. There are hills, valleys, river channels and plains stretching across what is today the seafloor between Britain and the European continent. For most of human prehistory, that landscape was dry land. People walked across it, hunted animals on it, built fires on it, and raised families on it. We know this not from written records. Writing did not exist yet, but from physical evidence dragged up by fishing nets and dredging equipment. Hand axes, some of them around 100,000 years old, pulled from the gravel of the North Sea floor. The hunters who made those tools did not know they were living on borrowed time, standing on ground that the sea would eventually claim. They could not have known. The transformation was far too slow for any individual life to witness, though it was fast enough on geological timescales to reshape the entire human geography of northwestern Europe. Between roughly 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended and global temperatures climbed, sea levels rose by something in the range of 30 metres. The low-lying plain connecting Britain to Denmark and the Netherlands, a territory we now call Doggerland, did not vanish overnight. It shrank slowly over millennia as coastlines crept inward and rivers widened into estuaries. What had been continuous land broke into islands, then sandbars, then nothing. The final blow may have come suddenly. A catastrophic submarine landslide off the coast of Norway around 8,200 years ago triggered a massive tsunami, the Storegga event, which almost certainly swept across whatever remained of the low-lying Doggerland margins and accelerated their disappearance beneath the waves. The land bridge was gone, the North Sea existed, and from that moment everything changed, not just geography, but the entire possibility space of human history in this corner of the world. Because a sea is never just an obstacle, it is also a road. The same water that now separated peoples could carry them to each other faster than any overland route through forest and marsh. Every age that followed would discover this truth and use it differently. Ice Age hunters gave way to Mesolithic foragers, who worked the coastlines and estuaries. They in turn gave way to farming communities, and then to Bronze Age traders moving metal and amber across the water. Roman commanders arrived with warships and turned the North Sea into a military supply line connecting the empire's northwestern frontier to the continent. After Rome withdrew, the sea became a migration corridor. Angles, Saxons and Jutes crossed it from what is now northern Germany and Denmark to settle in Britain, giving the English their language and the country half its name. Then came the Vikings, who understood better than almost anyone before them that a sea could be weaponized, turned into a highway for raids and conquest, that would reshape the political map of Britain and Northern Europe. After the raids came trade, and after trade came empire. Dutch herring fleets, merchant convoys, naval wars fought over who had the right to call these waters their own, and beneath all of it, for most of recorded history, ran the invisible reality of what lay under the seafloor. Oil and gas deposits that would not be discovered until the 20th century, but which would generate arguments, fortunes, disasters, and political crises that are still unresolved today. The North Sea has been a hunting ground, a migration route, a trading highway, a battlefield, an industrial extraction zone, and an ecological emergency all in turn, and sometimes all at once. Every generation that lived beside it saw something different when they looked at the water. What they could not see was how much the water was shaping them back. That story begins in a world of drowned plains and silent seafloor artifacts, and it is far stranger and more consequential than the grey surface of the water suggests. Picture it as it was, not as the seafloor it became, a wide flat plain stretching across what is now open water, connecting the chalk cliffs of southeastern England to the coastlines of Denmark, the Netherlands and Belgium without interruption. No channel, no sea, no separation. Just land, low, rich, and alive with the activity of a world we have almost entirely lost. This was Doggerland, and for most of human prehistory it was not a footnote. It was a centre. Geographers and archaeologists reconstructing its ancient landscape describe something remarkably abundant. Wide river valleys where the Thames and the Rhine did not empty separately into the ocean, but merged into a single great waterway, flowing southwest through what is now the English Channel and out into the Atlantic. The Meuse and the Scheldt joined this system too, feeding a network of lakes, lagoons and wetlands that spread across a plain roughly the size of present-day Britain. Along the higher ground, grasslands and open woodlands supported herds of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, wild horses and red deer. In the lower, wetter margins, fish-rich rivers and brackish marshes offered resources that were, by any Mesolithic measure, extraordinarily generous. Some researchers have called Doggerland Europe's most productive hunting, fowling, and fishing ground of the early post-glacial period. That claim is hard to verify precisely, but the physical evidence suggests it is not far wrong, and humans were there. This is not speculation or reasonable inference alone. It is documented by objects dragged from the sea floor. Fishermen and marine aggregate dredgers working the waters around 13 kilometres off the coast of Great Yarmouth have recovered, among other things, 28 flint hand axes of unambiguous Paleolithic design. These are not accidental finds. They are shaped tools, worked by human hands with deliberate skill, and they have been pulled from deposits on what is now the bottom of the North Sea. Alongside them, barbed antler points, mammoth bones, fragments of worked wood, and other stone tools. Taken together, these objects form a fragmented but real portrait of occupation, people living, hunting and tool-making on ground that the sea had not yet swallowed. The hand axes themselves present a puzzle that illustrates how much we still do not fully understand about this lost world. They are dated to around 100,000 years ago, placing them in the Middle Paleolithic, the era of Neanderthals as much as anatomically modern humans. But the precise age within that broad window remains uncertain, and the range of estimates stretches across tens of thousands of years. What the tools tell us clearly is that the plain was traversed by Ice Age hunters during periods when sea levels were low enough to expose it, and that is not a single moment in time but a recurring condition across multiple glacial cycles. Doggerland was not lost and found once. It was submerged and re-exposed repeatedly, as ice ages came and went, with the final inundation being the one that held permanently. That permanent inundation is where things get both important and genuinely complicated. The broad timeline most researchers agree on runs roughly from around 10,000 to 7,000 years before the present, coinciding with the end of the last ice age and the dramatic rise in global sea levels as ice sheets melted. Over that period, the sea level in this region rose by something approaching 120 metres in total since the glacial maximum, though the rate was not constant. Early in the post-glacial period, the rise was fastest. As temperatures stabilised, the pace slowed. Doggerland did not disappear in a single event but contracted across centuries and millennia, its highest points remaining as islands long after the surrounding plains had flooded. Here, though, the certainty starts to blur at the edges. Different geological models produce meaningfully different pictures of exactly when specific parts of the plain became sea, and when the land bridge finally broke. Some reconstructions favour a main phase of inundation between 8,000 and 6,000 BCE. More recent modelling tends to push the beginning of serious flooding back earlier, to perhaps 10,500 years before the present. The residual island extent, how much of Doggerland remained above water in its final centuries, and where exactly those remnants sat, is an active question that newer research has not fully settled. The Dogger Bank, that shallow elevation in the central North Sea that still causes headaches for navigators today, may have been one of the last such high points, an island or archipelago of islands that Mesolithic communities continue to occupy even as the surrounding low ground sank beneath the encroaching water. But the exact size, shape and duration of that final island remnant depends on which model you trust, and the models do not all agree. What most of them do agree on is the Storegga event. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive section of the Norwegian continental shelf gave way in a submarine landslide of extraordinary scale. The displacement sent a tsunami across the North Sea, with wave heights on the Scottish coast estimated at several metres, and the low-lying southern margins of whatever remained of Doggerland swept by walls of water moving at speed across shallow ground. Whether this event was the final blow that erased the last traces of habitable land, or whether it struck a plain already largely submerged, is again a matter the geological evidence cannot resolve with complete confidence. But the timing fits with the general collapse of the land bridge, and it is difficult to imagine that any Mesolithic communities still occupying the outer margins of Doggerland survived the event without catastrophic disruption. For the people living through this process, and there were people living through it as the artefacts confirm, the experience would not have felt like a single disaster. It would have felt, across generations, like a slow loss. Favourite fishing spots that began to flood seasonally, river crossings that no longer worked in certain seasons, wetlands expanding where there had been meadows, the shoreline always a little further in than your grandparents had described. The sea would have been something these communities understood as a living, advancing force, requiring constant adaptation, and eventually migration. They moved inland as the land they knew went under, carrying their tools and their knowledge with them, becoming the ancestors of populations that settled in what would become England, Denmark and the continent. This matters for understanding everything that followed. The separation of Britain from mainland Europe was not a geological given from the distant past. It was a recent event in human terms, completed within the same broad period when humans in the Middle East were beginning to develop agriculture and the first settled communities. When the Angles and Saxons looked across the North Sea and considered making the crossing, they were separated from Britain by a body of water that had not existed when their distant ancestors walked the same ground. When Viking longships set out from Scandinavian fjords toward the English coast, they were crossing over a drowned world that their own prehistoric forebears had once inhabited on foot. The North Sea was not ancient geography from their perspective in any meaningful sense. It was a wound in the landscape, relatively fresh, and the civilizations that grew up around it were still, in ways they could not have articulated, responding to the rupture it represented. there is something worth sitting with in the fact that our clearest evidence for this lost world consists not of monuments or settlements, but of sharp flint edges and worked antler, tumbled for millennia on a cold seafloor, then scooped up by machines dredging for construction aggregate. The people who made these objects left no written record, no architecture that survived the water, no tradition that carried their specific story forward into memory. What they left are tools, objects made with purpose for lives that the sea erased so thoroughly that we spent most of recorded history not even knowing those lives had happened. The archaeology of Doggerland is still in its early stages. The seafloor survey work, the sediment coring, the careful reconstruction of ancient riverbeds and shorelines. Much of it has only become possible in recent decades, and the picture changes with each new study. So, Doggerland stands at the beginning of North Sea history as both a foundation and a mystery. It tells us that this water was not always here, that the separation it created was contingent rather than inevitable, and that the human story in this region stretches back into depths that the sea has done its best to hide. The uncertainty in the geological record is not a frustration to be dismissed, but a reminder of how much we are still learning about a world that vanished beneath the waves before anyone thought to write anything down. What came after the inundation, the migrations, the trade routes, the kingdoms, the wars, all of it was shaped by the fact that the plain had gone under. The sea that replaced it was cold and grey, and for the people living on its shores full of possibility in ways that no one standing on a flooded marsh could quite have foreseen. The process did not happen all at once, and that is part of what makes it so difficult to fully grasp. Between roughly 10,000 and 6,000 years before the present, the North Sea came into existence, not through any single catastrophic breach, but through a long, relentless accumulation of rising water that progressively claimed the plain described in the previous section. What had been a living landscape became, piece by piece, a seabed. The transformation was one of the most consequential geographic events in the history of Northern Europe, and it is worth tracing carefully because its consequences echo through everything that followed. The mechanism was deceptively simple. As the last ice age ended and temperatures climbed, the vast ice sheets covering much of the northern hemisphere began to melt. That meltwater had to go somewhere, and it went into the oceans. Globally, sea levels rose by staggering amounts over the post-glacial period. In this region, by something approaching 120 metres since the glacial maximum, though not at a steady rate. The earliest phase of warming produced the fastest rises. By around 10,000 years ago, much of the deep southern basin of what would become the North Sea was already flooded. The central and northern plains were contracting. The higher ground, the ridges, the elevated margins, the Dogger Bank region in the centre, held out longer, but the direction of travel was inexorable. Then, around 8,400 to 8,200 years before the present, something accelerated the process dramatically. Sea levels jumped by between 1 and 4 metres in a relatively short window, driven by the catastrophic drainage of glacial lakes in North America as ice dams failed. This pulse of water hit an already shrinking Doggerland at a moment when its remaining above-water area was increasingly fragmented. What had been a broad, continuous plain was by this point a landscape of islands, channels, and shallow lagoons, and the sudden rise transformed much of that into open sea. Contemporary paleogeographic modelling gives this loss a precise scale that is worth pausing on. The North Sea zone lost approximately 127,000 square kilometres of land during the early Holocene transgression. That is roughly twice the combined land loss across the English Channel, the Western Seaways, and the Atlantic zones of Britain combined. The North Sea, in other words, was where the flooding hit hardest and where the human consequences were most severe. Between 8,000 and 7,500 years before the present, the Dover Strait finally breached. The chalk ridge connecting what would become southeastern England to the continent, already eroded, already fractured by previous flooding events, gave way entirely, and the waters of the Atlantic and the North Sea met through what is now the narrowest part of the English Channel, approximately 30 kilometres wide. Britain became an island, not in theory, not gradually as a rising tide made crossing inconvenient, but definitively as the last land connection was severed. The communities on either side of that breach were not separated by distance alone from that point forward. They were separated by open water, and the implications of that separation would play out across the next 8 millennia. The final disappearance of the remaining Doggerland Islands took another 1,000 years or so. By around 7,000 years before the present, the process was essentially complete. Jersey had become isolated from the continent. The Scilly Isles had fragmented into multiple separate islands. The low-lying ground of what would become East Anglia's fenland had turned from marsh into a genuine sea inlet, pushing communities onto the higher ridges of what we now call Norfolk and Kent. People who had lived on the outer margins of the plain retreated upward and inland, not in a single panicked exodus, but in a gradual generational withdrawal. The archaeology suggests communities responding adaptively, finding new fishing grounds, establishing new routes, building the social and practical knowledge required to live alongside a coastline that was still technically in motion. And here is where something unexpected emerges from the loss. The newly formed shallow seas did not simply replace the productive landscape of Doggerland with emptiness. They created something different, but in many ways equally rich. Shallow marine environments are among the most biologically productive on Earth, and the early North Sea, warm by the standards of later centuries, relatively sheltered, fed by the nutrient-rich outflows of the major river systems, became a fishery of extraordinary abundance. Archaeologists working on Mesolithic coastal sites around the edges of the early North Sea have noted a surge in evidence for seafaring and exchange in the period following the main inundation. The same communities that lost their land were developing the boats, the navigational knowledge, and the trading relationships that the new maritime geography demanded. Loss and adaptation ran together. This matters enormously for political and cultural geography. The creation of the North Sea did not simply sever Britain from Europe and leave two separate worlds facing each other across open water. It created a maritime zone that actively encouraged mobility, just of a different kind. A plain can be crossed on foot by anyone. A sea requires boats, and boats require organisation, knowledge, investment, and cooperation. The communities that developed those capabilities in the early Holocene were building the foundations of a maritime culture that would, thousands of years later, make possible the crossings of Angles and Saxons, the raids and settlements of Vikings, the herring fleets of the Dutch, and the naval confrontations of early modern England. The North Sea was not merely a barrier that replaced a highway. It was a different kind of highway, one that selected for specific skills and rewarded those who mastered it. There is also a deeper political implication embedded in the geology. Britain's island identity, that persistent self-conception as a place apart shaped by water and defined by its distance from continental entanglement, is not an ancient primordial condition. It was created by a specific geological event within human memory, in the sense that human beings were alive and present when it happened. The separation of Britain from Europe is younger than agriculture in the Middle East. It is younger than the domestication of cattle. It is, in the grand sweep of human history, almost recent. Every political and cultural consequence that flowed from Britain's island status, the particular character of its kingdoms, the development of its naval tradition, its relationships with the continental powers across the narrow water, all of it traces back ultimately to the moment when a chalk ridge gave way and the sea poured through. The birth of the North Sea is therefore not just the opening chapter of a regional story. It is the event that made the regional story possible at all. The flooding of Doggerland destroyed a world, displaced communities, erased landscapes that had been inhabited for hundreds of generations. But the sea that replaced it created conditions for something new, a maritime zone that would become one of the most historically consequential bodies of water on Earth. The cold, grey, difficult water that ships have navigated and fought over and fished for millennia was not waiting here from the beginning of time. It was made by ice and gravity and the slow logic of a warming world, and the people who eventually built civilizations along its shores were the inheritors of a catastrophe their ancestors had lived through and survived. For most of the millennia that followed the flooding of Doggerland, the North Sea was a sea of small actors, fishing communities, traders moving amber and furs along the coast, Bronze Age and Iron Age peoples who developed the navigational knowledge to cross it, but lacked the organizational reach to use it systematically. Then, in 12 BC, something changed the character of this maritime zone entirely. Rome arrived, and it arrived not tentatively but with a fleet, an agenda, and the full logistical weight of the ancient world's greatest imperial machine. The man who brought Rome to the North Sea was Nero Claudius Drusus, stepson of the Emperor Augustus, tasked with pushing Roman power into the Germanic territories beyond the Rhine. What Drusus understood, with the instinct of a commander who thought in supply lines and strategic geometry, was that the sea was not a boundary to this campaign. It was the campaign's most useful tool. He assembled the newly formed Classis Germanica, the Germanic fleet, and drove it northward through a network of canals cut through the Zuiderzee region, the Fossa Drusiana, into the open North Sea. This was not a coastal patrol. It was an expedition into waters that no organized military force had ever attempted to use as an operational theatre, aimed at subduing the Frisi and Chauci, the Germanic coastal peoples, and extracting from them tribute and submission. The sea almost killed him immediately. Drusus's fleet ran aground on the shallow sandy shoals that lay across his route, the same flat, treacherous bottom that would frustrate mariners in these waters for the next 2,000 years. The North Sea is not deep, open ocean. Its average depth across much of the southern basin is measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds, and its seabed is a shifting landscape of sandbanks and shoals that can trap a vessel before its crew understands the danger. Drusus survived, adapted, and pressed on, reaching the mouths of the Weser and securing the submission of the coastal tribes. But the encounter with the sea itself was its own kind of lesson. These were not Mediterranean waters. The rhythms, the dangers, and the demands of the North Sea were different from anything Roman naval doctrine had been built to handle. Over the following decade and a half, Rome kept returning. In 5 AD, Tiberius, who would later become emperor, led a combined land and sea operation that pushed the fleet further than it had gone before, reaching the Elbe and possibly beyond, into the approaches of what we now call the Skagerrak. The exact northern limit of this penetration is debated, the ancient sources frustratingly vague about precise geography. But the direction of ambition is unmistakable. Rome was treating the North Sea not as a peripheral inconvenience, but as a corridor into the continental interior, a line of advance that complemented and sometimes replaced the slow grind of overland campaigning through dense forest. What made this feasible was logistics, and the logic of water transport in the ancient world was stark. Moving supplies by road was expensive, slow, and subject to the bottlenecks of terrain. Moving the same supplies by river or coastal sea route cost roughly 1/6 as much. For an empire trying to sustain legions on a frontier thousands of kilometers from its Italian heartland, that ratio was not a minor advantage. It was what made the frontier viable at all. Roman liburnae, birems, and cargo barges could move grain, wine, horses, weapons, and men through the river systems feeding the North Sea and out along the coast, with an efficiency that no road network in northern Europe could match. The sea became the supply chain of empire. The infrastructure followed. At Velsen, on the North Sea coast of what is now the Netherlands, Rome built a harbour they called Flevum, a naval base and supply hub anchored to the Rhine fleet's operations and designed to project power outward along the coast. Flevum was not merely a military installation, it was the physical embodiment of a strategic vision in which the North Sea served as a connective tissue between the continental provinces and, increasingly, Britain. When Claudius's invasion of Britain in 43 AD established Britannia as a province, the organised maritime routes that the earlier expeditions had begun to trace became the essential links of an empire that now straddled the sea. Troops crossing to reinforce the British garrison, administrators travelling between London and Rome's Rhineland headquarters, merchants following in the military's wake. All of them used a corridor that the campaigns of Drusus and Tiberius had opened. The practical challenges never disappeared. The North Sea delivered storms with a violence that shocked sailors accustomed to the more predictable Mediterranean. Winter operations were essentially impossible, not just cold and uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous, with ice in the shallower northern reaches and storms capable of destroying entire squadrons. Roman commanders learned to confine their major expeditions to the summer months, to develop flat-bottomed vessels capable of navigating the shallow coastal waters rather than relying on the deep-keeled ships suited to open ocean, and to build into their planning and understanding that this particular sea would routinely take vessels and men regardless of preparation. The North Sea extracted a price from everyone who tried to master it. Rome paid that price and kept coming back. What Rome was building, almost without articulating it as such, was a template. The North Sea in the Roman period became for the first time a genuine zone of political and commercial integration, a space through which goods, soldiers, officials and ideas moved along organised routes between distinct territories. Britain's economic and cultural connections to the continent, already present in the Iron Age, were systematised and deepened by Roman administration into something approaching a managed maritime corridor. Samian ware from Gaul moved north through Flevum toward London. Iron from the Rhineland crossed to British forges. Tax revenues, census data, imperial edicts flowed back and forth across the water as a matter of routine imperial business. Rome would eventually pull back. By the early 5th century the legions were gone, the Classis Germanica disbanded, the harbour at Flevum long since abandoned. The frontier could not be held indefinitely, and Britain was left to manage its own affairs. But the sea did not forget what had been demonstrated. The North Sea had shown for the first time that it could function as the central artery of a large organised political system, that its cold water and treacherous shoals were not obstacles to empire, but the medium through which empire could be projected, sustained and administered. Every subsequent power that tried to dominate these waters was, knowingly or not, working from the blueprint that Rome had sketched. The Vikings would understand it. The Hanseatic merchants would refine it. The Dutch and the English would fight wars over who had the right to claim it. All of them were navigating in some sense in Rome's wake. Rome left a vacuum, and vacuums in history are never empty for long. When the last legions withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, they took with them the administrative architecture that had made the North Sea a managed corridor. The fleet, the harbours, the supply chains, the organised routes. What they could not take was the sea itself, and the sea remained exactly where it had always been, wide enough to separate peoples, narrow enough to cross. Within a generation it was being crossed again, but this time the movement was not a military expedition pushing outward from a secure imperial core. It was something older and more fundamental. It was people in motion, carrying everything they owned, looking for somewhere to land. The migration period, roughly spanning the 5th and 6th centuries AD, transformed the North Sea from a frontier into a highway. The pressures driving it were enormous and compounding. Hunnic expansions from the eastern steppes, destabilizing Germanic confederacies across Central Europe, the collapse of Roman order, removing the political structures that had kept population movements in check, land exhaustion, and coastal flooding along the continental shoreline that made familiar territories increasingly difficult to inhabit. Entire communities began to move, and for those living along the southern coast of Scandinavia and the northern seaboard of Germany, the most accessible direction of movement was west and across the water. The Venerable Bede, writing in the 8th century, names 3 principal groups and ties each to a specific continental homeland, with a precision that reads almost like a surveyor's report. The Angles, he says, came from Anglia, the Anglian Peninsula in what is now Schleswig-Holstein, a finger of land between modern Denmark and Germany that jutted toward the sea as though pointing at Britain. The Saxons came from Old Saxony, the territories of northwestern Germany. The Jutes came from Jutland, the Danish peninsula that gives the modern region its name, the same landmass that reaches furthest north into the cold water separating Scandinavia from the rest of Europe. Bede also maps their destinations. The Angles settled Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, the broad spine and eastern shoulder of Britain. The Saxons established Wessex, Sussex, and Essex, the south and southeast. The Jutes took Kent and the Isle of Wight. What Bede describes is not a single event but a process, waves of migration over more than a century, each crossing the same grey water between the same coastlines, gradually accumulating into a demographic transformation. Contemporary accounts suggest that the movements intensified after Roman withdrawal, as Britain lost the military capacity to resist and the administrative capacity to control who entered. Gildas, a 6th century British cleric writing with barely suppressed fury, describes the arrivals in terms of catastrophe, a plague of foreigners invited initially as defenders and then uncontrollable once they discovered the land's wealth. His account is polemical, shaped by religious outrage and survivors' trauma, and historians treat it accordingly. But the underlying fact he describes is real. People crossed the North Sea in very large numbers, and Britain was changed by it. How large those numbers were remains genuinely contested. Estimates range from tens of thousands to something approaching 200,000 over the span of the migration period, and the methodological problems of reconstructing population movement from fragmentary written records and variable archaeological evidence are severe. What modern genetics has added to this picture is striking. A major archaeogenetic study published in 2022, drawing on over 460 ancient genomes from early medieval Britain, found that between 25 and 47% of present-day English ancestry traces back to these continental migrants. In eastern England, where the settlements were densest, the signal is even stronger. Up to 76% of ancestry in early medieval individuals from this region links to a North European source spanning the Netherlands, northern Germany and Denmark. The sea, in other words, carried enough people to rewrite the genetic landscape of an entire country. But rewrite is not quite the right word, because it implies a clean erasure, and the evidence points instead toward something more complicated and more interesting. The archaeological record is a story of mixing, not replacement. Isotope analysis and skeletal studies show men, women and children crossing together. These were not warrior bands or raiding parties, but communities relocating wholesale, bringing their families, their livestock, their material culture, their memories. Once on British soil, they encountered not an empty landscape, but a Celtic population with its own traditions, its own ways of marking land and conducting life. What followed was a long, untidy process of cultural negotiation. The material evidence captures this ambiguity beautifully. The Saxon relief style of metalwork, a distinctive decorative tradition, appears north of the Thames but nowhere else, a product of continental craftwork adapting to local demand and local materials. The quoit brooch style, meanwhile, is uniquely British, developing in a way that draws on both continental Germanic forms and surviving Romano-British taste. These are not the artefacts of a culture that erased everything it found. They are the artefacts of a culture that was building itself out of two heritages simultaneously. Place names tell a similar story. Celtic toponyms disappear rapidly in the east, replaced by Anglo-Saxon forms, suggesting aggressive and thorough resettlement. But in the west and north, Celtic names survive in large numbers, preserved in the living landscape, indicating zones where integration was more gradual, and the indigenous presence remained substantial enough to shape the vocabulary of the land itself. Language followed this same hybrid logic. The Old English that emerged from the migration period was overwhelmingly Germanic in structure and vocabulary. Its verbs, its nouns, its fundamental grammatical skeleton, all derived from the continental dialects the migrants brought with them across the North Sea. But it absorbed, adapted and survived in a landscape already named and already inhabited, and the legal traditions that grew alongside it reflect the same composite character. Early codes like the Lex Anglorum, the Law of the Angles, codified a Germanic framework while making room for existing customs, a pragmatic accommodation to the reality that governing a mixed population required more flexibility than any single tradition could provide. The law, like the language and the metalwork, was being made from the collision of what had crossed the water with what was already waiting on the shore. This is what the North Sea accomplished in the migration period that Rome's organised maritime empire had never quite achieved. It delivered the raw material of a new identity. Not English identity as a finished product. That would take centuries more of conflict, conversion, and consolidation, but the essential components from which it would eventually be assembled. The Angles gave their name to the land itself. The Saxons and Jutes contributed their legal customs, their dialects, their ways of organising settlements and apportioning fields. The Celtic peoples already living in Britain contributed the continuity of place, the persistence of memory embedded in landscape. The North Sea carried the crossing, and everything that England would eventually become had to pass through that cold water to get there. The North Sea had just finished building England when it turned around and began attacking it. For roughly 2 centuries after the migration period settled into something resembling stability, the kingdoms carved from that great continental crossing, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, had time to develop their own rhythms. Monasteries accumulated wealth and manuscripts. Trade routes reopened along the coast. The church planted itself into the landscape with a confidence that seemed almost architectural. Lindisfarne, a small tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, became one of the most revered religious sites in the British Isles, a place of scholarship and sanctity, protected, its inhabitants must have believed, by its very remoteness from the world's violence. They were wrong about the remoteness. They had simply failed to account for what the sea could carry. On 8 June 793, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Viking raiders struck Lindisfarne, sacking the monastery and terrifying a kingdom that had not seen violence arrive from the water in quite this way. The scholar Alcuin of York, writing from the Frankish court where he served as an advisor to Charlemagne, expressed the shock of educated Christendom with a question that has echoed ever since. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. He was not exaggerating for rhetorical effect. Something genuinely new had arrived. Not migration, not empire building, but precision violence delivered from the sea and withdrawn before anyone could organise a response. What made this possible was a ship. The Viking longship was one of the most consequential pieces of technology the medieval world produced, not because of its size, but because of its proportions and its adaptability. Clinker-built, with overlapping planks that gave the hull a flexibility allowing it to flex rather than fracture in heavy swells. The longship was narrow relative to its length, a ratio of roughly 7:1, with a draft of only around a metre. That shallow draft was the crucial variable. It meant these vessels could be beached directly on shore, eliminating the need for harbour infrastructure. It meant they could enter river mouths and navigate upstream, carrying warriors deep into the interior of a continent that had no defensive doctrine for an enemy who arrived by water and vanished the same way. Thames, Humber, Severn, every major river system in England became a potential avenue of approach. Under oar, a longship could sustain 5 to 10 knots. Under sail, in favourable conditions, it could push toward 15. Against a world organised around land-based communication and response, this was effectively impossible to intercept. A monastery receiving word of raiders on the coast had, in all likelihood, already been raided. Speed and shallow draft alone do not explain the transformation of the North Sea. What amplified them was the strategic logic that Scandinavian communities had developed for using the sea as both a resource and a weapon. The levy system known as Lidang, by which coastal farmers were required to supply ships and crews for military expeditions, had integrated maritime capability so deeply into the social fabric of Scandinavian life that the sea was not an obstacle or a frontier. It was a road, and on that road the same vessel could carry a war party to Lindisfarne, a cargo of furs to Frankish traders, or a family of settlers to a new territory, depending entirely on opportunity and season. This dual, or rather triple, character of Viking activity is essential to understanding what the North Sea became in the 9th and 10th centuries. The raids were real, the violence was real, and the terror they produced in coastal communities across England, France and Ireland was a lived political fact. But the raiders were also traders, and the traders were also settlers, and the same currents that brought longships to Lindisfarne were simultaneously building a commercial and demographic network that linked Denmark, Norway, the Frisian coast, and England into an interconnected maritime world. Silver flowed in. Craft objects moved along the same routes that weapons had travelled. Norse vocabulary embedded itself into the English language with a thoroughness that still surfaces every time a speaker says sky, window, knife, or they. The violence and the exchange were not opposites. They were the same mobility operating under different conditions. The scale of that mobility shifted decisively in 865. What arrived in East Anglia that year was not a raiding party, but an army. The Great Heathen Army, as the Chronicle calls it, a coalition of Scandinavian forces that had decided the North Sea was not just a launch pad for seasonal attacks, but a corridor for permanent conquest. Within a year they had taken York, breaking the political spine of Northumbria. Within a decade they had campaigned across Mercia and East Anglia, killing King Edmund of East Anglia, later venerated as a martyr, and reducing England's political map to something that looked barely recognisable from what the migration period had produced. What emerged from this sustained military pressure was the Danelaw, a political zone covering roughly the eastern half of England, from the Thames estuary north through East Anglia and the Midlands to the Scottish border, where Danish law and Danish culture predominated. The boundary was not fixed. It shifted as military fortune shifted, as Alfred of Wessex pushed back from the south, and as Viking factions fractured among themselves. But its existence represented something remarkable. The North Sea had produced, through repeated crossings, a political partition of England itself. The descendants of one set of migrants, those who had crossed during the migration period, now found themselves governed in part by a new set of migrants whose ships had come from essentially the same coastline, the same Jutland peninsula and Danish archipelago that Bede had identified as the homeland of the original Angles and Jutes. The irony is almost architectural in its neatness. England had been built from North Sea crossings. Now those same crossings were reorganising it. The Danelaw left traces that outlasted the political settlement by centuries, place names ending in by Thorpe and Thwaite that mark the Eastern English landscape today, legal terminology that entered the common law through Danish administrative practice, patterns of land tenure and local governance that reflected Scandinavian custom. The North Sea had not simply connected two coastlines. It had carried enough culture across them, in enough waves and over enough decades, to reshape what it meant to live on the English side of the water. By the time the Viking Age wound toward its close in the mid-11th century, England and Denmark were bound together by something more durable than conflict. Cnut, a Danish king who ruled England, Denmark and Norway simultaneously in the early 11th century, was himself the product of this entanglement, a ruler whose power depended entirely on the same maritime mobility that had made Lindisfarne possible. The raid and the dynasty were, in the end, different expressions of the same cold water. The transformation from raid to rule did not happen overnight, and it did not happen cleanly. It happened the way most lasting political changes happen, through a long grinding series of military confrontations, negotiated settlements, broken agreements, and the slow accumulation of demographic facts that no treaty could entirely reverse. The pivot point came in 878. Alfred of Wessex, the one English king who had survived the great heathen army's onslaught with both his kingdom and his ambition intact, defeated the Danish leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington, a victory decisive enough to force something neither side had previously managed to produce, a durable agreement. The Treaty of Wedmore, struck that same year, and formalised further in the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum around 886 to 890, drew a line across England. To the north and east of it lay the Danelaw, recognised as a zone of Danish self-rule, operating under Danish law. To the south and west lay Alfred's England, reconstituted and for the moment intact. Guthrum, under the terms of the settlement, accepted Christian baptism, with Alfred standing as his godfather, a ritual that embedded the political agreement inside a theological framework, giving it the weight that any secular contract of the period could not fully carry on its own. What the Danelaw actually meant in practice was not simple occupation, but a wholesale reordering of governance and daily life across the Eastern Midlands and beyond. Danish legal custom replaced, or sat alongside, the English systems that had previously governed those territories. Land tenure shifted, administrative structures reorganised around different units and different assumptions about how authority was held and transmitted. The place names tell part of this story still. Every English village ending in by, the old Norse word for settlement, every thorpe and thwaite scattered across Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, marks a point where Scandinavian settlers planted themselves in the landscape with enough permanence to rename it. This was not a garrison. It was colonisation, and it ran deep enough that some of its legal vocabulary was still visible in English common law centuries later. Danish political control in England did not last in its formal sense. The pressure Alfred had applied, and that his successors maintained, gradually eroded the Danelaw's political coherence from the south. By 954, when Eric Bloodaxe, the last Danish ruler of Northumbria, a figure whose name carries a rather blunt summary of his approach to governance, was expelled from York, the Danelaw as a distinct political entity had effectively collapsed. England, nominally at least, was unified under an English crown. The Scandinavian presence remained, written into the landscape and the legal codes, but the political partition was over. Except, of course, that the North Sea had other ideas. If the Danelaw represented the first phase of Scandinavian power in England, a military conquest that settled into a negotiated zone, what followed in the early 11th century was something more ambitious, and in a sense more revealing about what the North Sea had become. Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, launched a full-scale invasion of England in 1013, driving the English king Ethelred, the one history remembers with the somewhat unfair epithet unready, into temporary exile in Normandy. Sweyn's reign in England lasted only weeks before his death in early 1014, but it opened a door that his son Cnut walked through with rather more staying power. Cnut the Great is one of the more extraordinary figures of the medieval North Sea world, and not primarily because of the apocryphal story about commanding the tide, a tale almost certainly invented to illustrate his piety, not his arrogance. What makes Cnut remarkable is the political structure he built. By 1016 he held England. By 1018 he was king of Denmark. By 1028 Norway had fallen into his orbit as well. What historians now call the North Sea Empire, though no one at the time used that phrase, was a thalassocracy, a realm held together not by contiguous land borders, but by control of the sea lanes connecting its components. The North Sea, that cold, contested water, was not the edge of this political world. It was the centre of it. Cnut understood this in practical terms. He reorganised England into 4 great earldoms, East Anglia, Northumbria, Mercia and Wessex, along Scandinavian administrative lines, blending English and Danish governance into a system capable of running a cross-sea empire. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, a dynastic move that embedded his rule in English political legitimacy while maintaining his Scandinavian identity. He kept a fleet. He moved between his kingdoms. He managed the North Sea as a corridor of power rather than a barrier between separate worlds, and for roughly 2 decades it worked. Then he died in 1035 at around 40 years old, and the empire that depended on his particular combination of energy and authority began almost immediately to fracture. Harold Harefoot, his son by a previous relationship, seized England. Harthacnut, Knut, his son with Emma and his designated heir in Denmark, spent the early years of the succession crisis managing threats from Norway. By the time Harthacnut finally secured the English throne in 1040, the North Sea Empire existed in name only. When Harthacnut died in 1042, the English throne passed to Edward, the son of Emma and the long-exiled Ethelred, and the Scandinavian political claim to England effectively ended, or nearly ended, because the logic of the North Sea did not dissolve with the empire. Norway still looked toward England. Ambitious Scandinavian rulers still calculated that the sea crossing was achievable, the prize substantial. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada, Harold the Hard Ruler, one of the most experienced and formidable military commanders in northern Europe, led a Norwegian fleet up the Humber estuary, defeated a local English force at the Battle of Gate Fulford, and seemed poised to reopen the Scandinavian chapter of English history. He was met instead at Stamford Bridge by Harold Godwinson, the English king who had marched his army north with a speed that surprised everyone, including Hardrada. The battle was short and conclusive. Hardrada died on the field. The Norwegian army that had arrived in hundreds of ships departed in fewer than 30. Stamford Bridge is commonly treated as the close of the classic Viking age, and in political terms that framing has something to it. The era of Scandinavian rulers contesting the English crown through North Sea crossings was, for practical purposes, finished. But it would be a mistake to read that as the end of North Sea interdependence. The connections were too deep, the trade routes too established, the cultural entanglement too thorough to dissolve because a battle had been fought in Yorkshire. What ended at Stamford Bridge was the Viking claim to rule England. What did not end was the North Sea itself, still the same water, still connecting the same coastlines, already preparing to carry the next transformation westward. The sword gave way to the ledger, not immediately and not entirely. Power along the North Sea coast was never purely peaceful, and the merchants who built the next great chapter of this sea's history were not naive about the uses of force. But in the centuries following Stamford Bridge, the defining energy moving across these waters shifted from military conquest towards something that proved, in the long run, at least as transformative: organised commerce on a scale the medieval world had never quite seen before. The instrument of that transformation was the Hanseatic League, a network of merchant cities and trading posts that gradually assembled itself across the northern coasts of Europe from roughly the 13th century onward, binding the Baltic, the North Sea and the Atlantic approaches into a single commercial system. The Hansa, as it was known, was not a state. It had no king, no standing army, no central treasury in the modern sense. What it had was something more durable in practice: shared interests, shared law, and a series of strategically placed outposts called contours that functioned as nodes in a trade network of remarkable range and sophistication. 4 major contours anchored the system, and 3 of them sat directly in the North Sea world. In Bergen, on the Norwegian coast, the Bryggen, the row of distinctive timber warehouses that still lines the harbour today, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, became the nerve centre for the Norwegian stockfish trade. Dried cod from the Arctic waters off northern Norway moved through Bergen in quantities that fed half of Europe during the lean months of the year. The Bergen contour, established around the mid-14th century, controlled that flow with the disciplined efficiency of a modern commodity exchange. Merchants lived within its compound, operated under its rules, and moved product through its warehouses according to carefully maintained records and standards. In London, the Steelyard, a complex of buildings near the Thames between what is now Cannon Street and the river, gave Hanseatic merchants a base of operations in the English capital that dated back at least to the 13th century, with formal privileges that fluctuated through the centuries as English monarchs calculated the political cost of German commercial power against the practical benefit of reliable trade. Through the Steelyard, English wool and cloth moved east into continental markets, while incoming cargoes brought beeswax, furs, salted herring, stockfish and beer westward. The contour was not a mere warehouse. It was a legally autonomous community, operating its own courts, maintaining its own seal and treasury, negotiating directly with the English crown, and regulating the quality and pricing of the goods that passed through its gates. Bruges performed a different but equally critical function. The Flemish city sat at the crossroads between the North Sea and the wealth of the Mediterranean world. Broadcloth from Flanders, among the finest textile production in Europe, moved outward through the Bruges contour, while imports arriving from the east and south brought metals, spices and luxury goods that northern buyers could not produce themselves. Formalised in 1347, the Bruges contour organised its membership into 3 regional thirds, each block of merchants sending representatives to manage collective decisions, a governance structure that looks, in retrospect, like an early prototype of the kind of institutional representation that commercial capitalism would later require at much larger scales. What made the Hanseatic system genuinely revolutionary was the way it integrated these individual nodes into a coherent commercial ecology. Timber and grain flowed westward from Scandinavia and the Baltic. Fish, stockfish from Norway, herring in enormous volumes from the southern Baltic and the North Sea itself, moved in every direction, serving as both a dietary staple and a trade currency. Cloth and luxury goods moved eastward from Flanders and southward from England. The North Sea was the artery through which all of it circulated, a sea whose cold waters and reliable winds made it not an obstacle but a highway. A merchant in Lübeck, the League's anchor city, could reasonably expect to know the price of English wool in Bruges, the condition of the Bergen stockfish harvest, and the going rate for Baltic grain in Hamburg, because the network he belonged to made that information flow possible. Underpinning all of this was law. The spread of Lübeck law from its origins in Lübeck's own city charter of 1226 gave roughly 100 towns across northern Europe a shared framework for municipal self-government. Cities that adopted Lübeck law empowered their merchant guilds to elect councils, manage courts, and enforce trade statutes. This was not a trivial development. It meant that a merchant crossing from Hamburg to Bergen to London was not stepping into a completely foreign legal environment each time. He was operating within a recognizable system of commercial rights and obligations that the network had collectively agreed to honor. The contours themselves embodied this principle taken to its logical extreme. Legally autonomous corporations, universitas mercatorum in the Latin of the documents, with their own statutes, their own dispute resolution mechanisms, and their own relationships with local rulers that they negotiated from a position of indispensable commercial value. Port cities grew up around these trade routes in ways that changed the coastline of northern Europe permanently. Hamburg and Bremen expanded as gateway cities for goods moving between the Baltic and the North Sea. Bergen's entire urban identity was shaped by its role in the fish trade. London's riverside developed around the traffic that the Steelyard and its surrounding merchant activity generated. These were not passive recipients of commercial fortune. They were active participants in a competitive, legally sophisticated commercial culture that crossed the political boundaries of kingdoms and principalities because the sea that connected them recognized no such borders. There is something worth pausing on in that point. The North Sea, by this period, had become genuinely transnational in a way that the political world around it had not. Kings and princes drew lines on land, fought over territories, and built their power on the control of people and places within fixed boundaries. The Hanseatic merchants built their power on movement, on the continuous circulation of goods across the same waters that had once carried Viking longships and Roman supply vessels. The sea was the constant, the political arrangements on shore were the variables, and what the Hanse understood, with a clarity that came from practical necessity, was that the sea would keep moving goods whether or not any particular king chose to cooperate, as long as the network's own legal and institutional structure held firm. By the mid-15th century, the Hanseatic League had reached something close to the peak of its influence. Its contours regulated trade from the Russian city of Novgorod to the English coast. Its merchants had established the legal and institutional frameworks that would shape European commercial law for generations. Its port cities had grown into genuinely significant urban centres, and the North Sea sat at the centre of all of it, cold, grey, indispensable, the engine of a commercial world that no single power controlled, but that everyone with access to its coastline was trying to turn to advantage. The next transformation was already approaching from the water, and it would arrive on the backs of an unexpected fleet, chasing a very particular kind of fish. The fish that the previous section ended on was not a metaphor. It was herring, small, silver-sided, abundant in the cold shallows of the North Sea, and so nutritionally dense and so easily preserved that medieval Europe built an entire economic architecture around catching and selling it. Herring was protein for the poor, commodity for the merchant, and diplomatic currency for the powerful. It fed populations through the lean months of winter, filled the holds of trading ships moving between ports from Bergen to Lisbon, and sustained the kind of hard physical labour, at sea, in fields, in mines, that kept medieval civilization functioning. Historians have called it the most commercially important fishery in history. People at the time called it the silver of the sea, and they were not speaking loosely. To understand why herring mattered this much, you have to hold two facts in mind simultaneously. First, herring spoils fast. Left untreated, a catch is worthless within hours. Second, herring moves in vast schools through predictable routes at predictable times of year, which means that when the fish arrive, they arrive in quantities that overwhelm any local market immediately. Preservation was not just a convenience, it was the entire commercial premise. Without a reliable method of keeping the fish edible across weeks and months of transportation, the North Sea's herring abundance was economically useless beyond a narrow coastal strip. And the method that changed everything was salt. The technique known as jibbing, gutting the herring and packing it in layers of salt almost immediately after capture, had Flemish origins and came into wide use in the early 16th century. What it made possible was a ship that could stay at sea not just for a day's fishing but for weeks, processing its catch aboard and returning with a hold full of preserved saleable product. The Dutch took that possibility and built a vessel around it, the herring bus. The bus was purpose-built for industrialized fishing in a way that no earlier vessel quite matched. Roughly 20 meters long, displacing 60 to 100 tons, it carried a crew of 18 to 30 men and was fitted out not merely to catch herring but to process and barrel it at sea. This was the key innovation, not in the hull design alone, but in the entire operational concept. By handling the fish on deck as soon as they were drawn in, packing them in standardized barrels with precise quantities of salt, according to regulated quality grades, the bus transformed the catch into a finished export commodity before it ever touched shore. Dutch authorities enforced strict quality standards on the barreled product, which gave Dutch salt herring a reputation for consistency that commanded premium prices across European markets. The first buses appear in records around 1415, and across the following 2 centuries the fleet grew into something that, by modern standards, looks less like a fishing industry and more like a strategic national enterprise. By the early 1600s, somewhere between 400 and 500 buses worked the Doggerbank and the waters around Shetland in a normal season. In peak years, estimates put the fleet at close to 1,000 vessels, crewed by as many as 20,000 sailors. A pamphlet from 1614 calculated, with the enthusiasm of an advocate, though the underlying numbers were real enough, that a single summer fleet could bring in more than £1 million in value, clearing over £500 in profit per vessel after costs. Even heavily discounted for the boosterism of the source, those figures represent wealth generation on a scale that reshaped the economy of the Low Countries, because the fishery did not exist in isolation. It pulled an entire supply chain into existence around it. Salt had to be refined and imported. Nets had to be manufactured and repaired. Barrels had to be made by the tens of thousands every season. The fish, once brought ashore, had to be sorted, regraded, and distributed to inland markets across northern Europe. Each of these requirements fed a specialized industry, and each industry fed others. The shipyards that built and maintained the buses were among the most technically sophisticated in Europe. The salt trade connected the Dutch Republic to Portugal and France, knitting those commercial relationships into the broader Atlantic economy. The revenues from successful fishing seasons were not spent and forgotten. They were reinvested, channeled into new vessels, new warehouses, new financial instruments designed to spread the risk of seafaring across multiple investors. By 1636, herring had become the 3rd largest Dutch export, behind only gin and cheese, and ahead of almost everything else the Republic produced. That ranking tells you something important. The Dutch Golden Age, that extraordinary cultural and commercial explosion that gave the world Rembrandt and Vermeer and the first modern stock exchange, was not built on abstraction. It was built on fish. The profits from the North Sea herring fishery underwrote the construction of the Vloot, the shallow drafted high-capacity cargo vessel that made Dutch shipping the largest and cheapest in the world. They helped fund the Amsterdam entrepot, the great warehouse at the centre of European trade, through which commodities from across the known world passed on their way to buyers across the continent. They fed the capitalisation of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange and the Amsterdamse Wisselbank, the institutions that made Amsterdam the financial centre of the 17th century. the place where risk could be calculated, priced and shared in ways that had simply not existed before. There's direct line, in other words, from the herring bus working the Dogger Bank in December cold to the merchant princes of Amsterdam funding voyages to the East Indies. The North Sea was not background to the Dutch Golden Age. It was the foundation of it. Mastering these waters, learning to fish them efficiently, to process the catch at sea, to preserve and sell the product to consistent standards across long supply chains, was the first act of an economic ascent that would make the Dutch Republic, briefly and brilliantly, the most commercially powerful state in the world. That mastery did not go unnoticed. England watched. England had its own herring grounds, its own fishing fleets, its own ambitions on these waters, and England had, by the 17th century, built enough naval power to begin asking a question that no one with a strong fleet and a rival in plain sight could resist asking for long. Why should any sea belong to someone else? The answer to that question would not be settled by commerce or by law. It would be settled by cannon fire, 3 separate times, across the same cold grey water that had made the Dutch so formidably rich. The question did not stay rhetorical for long. England had watched the Dutch Republic turn the North Sea into a private engine of wealth. The herring fleets, the Vloot ships, the Amsterdam entrepot handling goods that English merchants felt they had an equal right to carry. And by the middle of the 17th century, Parliament decided to do something about it. In 1651, the English Parliament passed the Navigation Act, a piece of legislation whose simplicity concealed its ferocity. All trade with English colonies had to be carried in English ships. Not Dutch ships, not any other ships. English ships, crewed by English sailors. At a stroke, Parliament had declared war on the most efficient merchant marine in the world, and the Dutch Republic knew exactly what it meant. The Dutch response was predictable, because there was really only one possible response. The Navigation Act was an economic attack, and the Dutch had the naval capacity to fight back. Before the formal shooting started, English warships had already seized 140 Dutch merchantmen in 1651, then another 30 in January 1652. These were not accidents. They were signals, and the signal they sent was that the North Sea was no longer big enough for both ambitions to coexist peacefully. The First Anglo-Dutch War began in earnest in May 1652, when an English fleet under Admiral Robert Blake and a Dutch fleet under Admiral Martin Tromp met off Dover. The encounter was tense and confused in the way that early modern naval battles often were, but the underlying arithmetic was stark. The Dutch fielded a fleet that eventually reached 154 warships across the course of the war, while England initially put fewer than 60 ships to sea. On paper, the Dutch should have won quickly. In practice, the war became something more complicated than a simple count of hulls. At the Battle of the Gabbard in June 1653, and again at the Battle of Scheveningen in August 1653, English fleet tactics, lining warships up in disciplined formation to maximise broadside fire, began to show their potential. The Dutch lost around 60 warships by the war's end. The English, exploiting that final summer victory, imposed a blockade that throttled Dutch access to the Baltic, where the Republic sourced the timber and grain on which its entire commercial system depended. The Treaty of Westminster in 1654 ended the fighting, but it settled nothing fundamental. The underlying rivalry was too large, too structural, too tangled up with money and pride and geography to be resolved by a single peace. The Second Anglo-Dutch War opened in 1665, and both sides arrived with more ships, better organised, and grimmer about what was actually at stake. Fleets of roughly 131 warships faced each other, and the early advantage went to England. At the Battle of Lowestoft on the 13th of June 1665, the Dutch suffered a catastrophic defeat. ships shattered, their admiral killed, the Republic's naval confidence badly shaken. It looked, briefly, like England might break Dutch sea power entirely. It did not. The following year, in June 1666, the 4 days' battle, one of the longest naval engagements in the age of sail, fought across open North Sea water, swung back decisively in the Dutch direction. And then, in June 1667, the Dutch did something so audacious it stunned the English political establishment into silence. While peace negotiations were still theoretically underway, a Dutch fleet sailed directly up the Medway, broke through the chain stretched across the river, burned several major English warships at their moorings, and towed away the Royal Charles, the English flagship, as a trophy. It was arguably the most humiliating single event in the history of the Royal Navy, and it forced England to sign the Treaty of Breda on terms it would not have accepted under any other circumstances. The Dutch had won the second round. But winning a battle and winning a war's momentum are different things, and the Third Anglo-Dutch War, which ran from 1672 to 1674, illustrated exactly that gap. England this time entered an alliance with France, whose armies were already tearing through the Dutch Republic's land defences in what the Dutch called the Rampjaar, the disaster year. An Anglo-French fleet of 98 great ships and frigates confronted a Dutch navy of roughly 55 ships. By the arithmetic of the sea, the Dutch were hopelessly outmatched, and yet the war on the water did not go the way those numbers suggested it should. The Battle of Solebay on the 7th of June 1672 opened the campaign in the North Sea with the Dutch landing a stunning surprise attack on the combined fleet as it lay at anchor, inflicting serious damage and preventing an English landing on the Dutch coast. Then came the twin battles of Schooneveld in June 1673, where the Dutch Admiral de Ruyter used aggressive sorties from shallow coastal waters to disrupt and blunt the Anglo-French fleet's attempts to press home its numerical advantage. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Texel on the 21st of August 1673, another Dutch strategic victory, another English invasion plan halted. Parliament, increasingly hostile to the war's cost and suspicious of what an English alliance with Catholic France actually meant for English interests, forced a separate peace in 1674. 3 wars, 22 years, and what had actually changed? More than the final peace treaty suggested, the Dutch Republic emerged from the Third War with its independence intact, its commercial network battered but surviving, its naval officers celebrated across Europe as some of the finest tacticians of the age. And yet the underlying shift in power was real and running in one direction. England had been learning across every engagement, learning how to organise line-of-battle tactics, how to fund prolonged naval campaigns, how to build and supply a permanent professional fleet capable of projecting force far beyond the Channel. The Navigation Acts remained in force, diverting trade toward English hulls. English shipbuilding programmes accelerated. The institutional machinery that would eventually produce the Royal Navy's 18th century dominance, the dockyards, the financing mechanisms, the administrative bureaucracy of the Navy Board, was being assembled fight by fight, decade by decade. The Dutch Republic had other problems: France pressing from the land, the structural costs of defending both a maritime empire and a continental border, the sheer financial exhaustion of sustaining a navy that could match England, while also funding armies that could hold off Louis XIV. The Republic never again threatened English commercial supremacy after 1674. The herring fleet still sailed, the Amsterdam Exchange still traded, but the centre of maritime gravity had moved. The North Sea, which had been a Dutch lake in all but name during the Golden Age, was becoming an English one. What these 3 wars proved, beyond the specific tactical lessons of each engagement, was that the cold grey water between these 2 coastlines was not simply a highway for cod and herring. It was the place where the financial strength of states and the organisational capacity of their navies were tested against each other in the most unambiguous way possible. The nation that could build more ships, keep them at sea longer, fund the campaigns, and maintain the discipline of fleet formation under fire would control not just these waters, but the trade routes that radiated out from them into every ocean on earth. England had learned that lesson. It would not forget it. By the time the Third Anglo-Dutch War settled into an uneasy peace, England was no longer simply defending its coastline. It was building something larger, a maritime state whose appetite extended far beyond the grey chop of the southern North Sea and into every ocean the known world contained. The transition from defensive island to projecting empire did not happen overnight, and it did not happen by accident. It was constructed, piece by piece, out of timber and tar and administrative ambition, in dockyards and counting houses and naval offices strung along the English coast. The story of that construction begins earlier than most people realise. When Henry VIII looked at his kingdom's coastline in the early 16th century, what he saw was vulnerability, and he responded to it with characteristic decisiveness. He founded the first permanent royal dockyards. Portsmouth in 1496, Woolwich in 1513, Deptford in 1513, and later Chatham in 1567. These were not improvised repair sheds. They were industrial facilities, the most sophisticated state-run manufacturing complexes in England, capable of building, fitting, supplying and maintaining a permanent fleet of warships. When the Navy Board was established, it created the administrative backbone that would govern English, and later British, sea power for generations. The lesson Henry understood was one that seems obvious in retrospect but was radical for its time. A navy is not something you summon when you need it, and dismiss when the danger passes. It is a permanent instrument of the state, which means the state must permanently maintain it. That philosophy paid its first spectacular dividend in 1588. When the Spanish Armada moved up the Channel in tight defensive formation, it met an English fleet of 110 warships, including 24 first-rate great ships, and approximately 24,000 men. The Armada is usually told as a Channel story, a tale of fire ships at gravlines and Protestant winds. But the North Sea was woven into it just as deeply. England's ability to concentrate that fleet, to keep it at sea, to press the Armada northward, and then guard against any secondary Spanish approach from the east, depended on the network of dockyards and supply lines that Henry and his successors had built. The North Sea's eastern coast and its access routes to Baltic timber and naval stores were part of what England was defending that summer. The Armada was not merely a threat to the Channel shore. It was a threat to the entire maritime architecture England had been assembling. This was not lost on the Admiralty. From the 1540s onward, the Crown had maintained a dedicated narrow seas squadron, a permanent naval command responsible for the southern North Sea between England and the Spanish Netherlands. This was the sea's front door, the approach route any continental power would have to control before it could seriously threaten English trade or English soil. Keeping that door guarded was not optional. England's grain imports from the Baltic passed through those waters. The fishing fleets that fed its coastal communities worked those same passages, and the merchant convoys that were slowly building England's overseas wealth required that the approaches to the North Sea remain, at minimum, contested, and preferably held. The contrast with what the Dutch had built across those same years only sharpened the point. Dutch commercial genius in the 16th and 17th centuries was genuinely extraordinary. The herring bus fleet alone numbered between 400 and 500 vessels in the early 17th century, and by 1633 a single season could see 1,500 buses at sea, supported by 20 armed naval escorts. By the 1660s, contemporary accounts recorded as many as 2,200 herring vessels operating out of Dutch ports. The VOC, the United East India Company, founded in 1602, operated roughly 150 ships on global routes, making it the largest commercial fleet on Earth. The Dutch had turned maritime commerce into an engine of national wealth that no other European state could match for efficiency or scale. But efficiency and scale are different things. The Dutch commercial system was brilliant at generating wealth and surprisingly agile at deploying naval force in short bursts. What it struggled to sustain was the kind of permanent, expanding, institutionally backed naval power that England was building. The Republic faced a structural problem that no amount of Dutch ingenuity could entirely dissolve. It was simultaneously a maritime empire and a continental state, perpetually exposed to the land-based ambitions of France and the administrative costs of holding two entirely different kinds of frontier at once. England, sitting behind its moat, could concentrate. It could invest in dockyards without worrying about field armies. It could build the Navy Board's bureaucratic machinery, refine its fleet financing, and expand its ships of the line without the constant distraction of defending a land border against a power the size of France. By the Restoration, the Royal Navy fielded roughly 30 ships of the line and a dedicated North Sea squadron. By the 1680s and 1690s, expansion programs had raised that number to over 100 ships of the line, a force the Dutch Republic simply could not match indefinitely while also paying for the armies that stood between Amsterdam and Paris. The wars had taught England how to fight at sea. The dockyards and the financial systems that supported them taught it how to fight at sea continuously, across years and decades, without the fleet ever truly standing down. What the North Sea represented in this context was not just a body of water to be crossed or controlled. It was the guarded front yard of an emerging empire. Mastery of those waters meant that England's home coasts were secure, that the Baltic trade routes feeding its shipyards with timber and tar remained open, and that any colonial expedition, whether to the Caribbean, to West Africa, or eventually to India and beyond, could depart from a base that was not itself under threat. Every ship that left an English port for the wider world sailed out through waters that England increasingly dominated. That dominance was not maintained by geography alone. It was maintained by permanent institutions, by the dockyards at Chatham and Deptford, by the Navy Board's supply chains, by the financial machinery that could sustain a fleet at sea long after a purely commercial state would have recalled it to port to save money. The Dutch had shown what maritime commerce could achieve at its most brilliant. England had learned that lesson thoroughly, absorbed it, paid for it in the blood and expense of 3 wars, and then added something the Dutch model lacked: the institutional will to keep a navy permanently in being, not just as a commercial escort, but as an instrument of state power. The North Sea had been a Dutch lake during the Golden Age. By the close of the 17th century it was becoming something else, the sheltered inner sea of a kingdom that had decided, with a deliberateness that would define the next 2 centuries, that the ocean was where its future lived. 2 centuries after England's dockyards and institutional will had eclipsed Dutch maritime power, the same grey waters were about to host something neither Henry VIII nor William of Orange could have imagined. A collision of steel fortresses, each one displacing more tonnage than the entire fleet that had faced the Spanish Armada, moving toward each other across the North Sea at speeds that would have seemed impossible to any admiral from the age of sail. On 31 May 1916, Britain's Grand Fleet and Germany's High Sea Fleet met off the coast of Jutland in what became the largest naval battle of the First World War, and arguably the most consequential engagement these waters had witnessed since the Anglo-Dutch conflicts of the previous century. The scale was staggering. Britain fielded 150 warships, including 37 battleships. Germany answered with 91. The 2 fleets together represented an astonishing concentration of industrial civilization, every ship the product of years of manufacturing, colossal quantities of steel, complex armament systems, and the logistical machinery of entire national economies bent toward the single purpose of controlling the sea. The battle itself was tactically inconclusive in ways that frustrated both sides and have puzzled historians ever since. Britain lost more ships and more men, around 6,094 killed against Germany's approximately 2,551. The German High Sea Fleet fought with skill and nerve, and at several points during the engagement it was the British line that found itself in danger of being cut. When the firing finally stopped and the fleets disengaged in the darkness and fog of early June, Germany's commanders could point to the casualty numbers and claim a tactical success. The British press, expecting another Trafalgar, was baffled and disappointed. But the numbers that mattered most were not the ones printed in the casualty columns. They were the numbers of ships that returned to their home ports afterward, and what those ships had preserved by surviving. The strategic logic of the North Sea in 1916 had everything to do with blockade. Britain's fundamental weapon against Germany was not its armies in France, grinding through mud at the Somme. It was its navy's ability to seal the North Sea and choke off German imports. Coal, foodstuffs, nitrates for explosives, copper for shell casings, rubber, cotton, all of it had to reach Germany by sea, and the Grand Fleet's continued presence in Scapa Flow meant that it effectively didn't. The blockade was slow, unglamorous, and brutal in its effects. It did not appear on maps of the Western Front. But by 1916 it was strangling the German economy with a methodical efficiency that no land campaign could replicate. The real question at Jutland, then, was not which side sank more ships in an afternoon. It was which fleet would still be capable of controlling the North Sea when the guns went quiet. Germany needed to break the blockade. Britain needed to preserve it. Measured by that standard, the battle's outcome was unambiguous. The High Sea Fleet returned to port and, with very few exceptions, stayed there for the rest of the war. The Grand Fleet remained at sea, maintaining the cordon that had been strangling Germany since August 1914. German commanders had not found the answer they were looking for. Faced with the impossibility of challenging British dominance in a second fleet engagement, Germany turned instead to unrestricted submarine warfare, a decision that would eventually bring the United States into the war, contributing directly to Germany's defeat in 1918. Understanding how Britain had assembled a fleet capable of that kind of sustained dominance takes you back to the same theme that had defined these waters for centuries: the conversion of geographical position and economic organisation into maritime power. More than 40% of the 150 ships at Jutland had been built in Scottish shipyards. The River Clyde alone had supplied 63 vessels, including some of the newest and most powerful dreadnought battleships, ships like HMS Berham and HMS Valiant, the cutting edge of industrial naval architecture. The connection between British industrial capacity and North Sea dominance was not metaphorical. It was embedded in the steel plates and riveted hulls of every ship that took up position in the Grand Fleet's battle line. This was war conducted at the scale of entire economies. The dreadnought was not merely a weapon, it was a statement about what an industrial state could organise and sustain. A single ship of the line in Nelson's era required timber from dozens of oak trees and the labour of skilled craftsmen working across months. A dreadnought battleship required steel mills, heavy engineering works, specialised armour plate manufacturers, gun foundries, electrical engineers, hydraulics experts, and the rail networks to move all of those components to the slipways on the Clyde or the Tyne. The British ability to produce those ships, and to keep producing them faster than Germany could match, was itself a form of strategic pressure that the Battle of Jutland made visible in the most direct possible way. The blockade strategy that Jutland preserved also required a kind of industrial patience that earlier centuries would not have recognised as warfare at all. There was no single dramatic engagement to point to, no moment analogous to breaking through an enemy line or capturing a fleet. There was instead the daily grinding maintenance of naval presence. Ships on patrol, coaling stations kept supplied, intelligence networks tracking enemy movements, the administrative machinery of the Admiralty processing information and deploying resources across months and years. The North Sea had become not simply a battlefield but a managed space, a zone of economic and strategic pressure sustained by the full institutional weight of a modern state. What connects Jutland to everything that came before it in these waters is precisely that continuity of purpose underneath the radical change of scale and technology. The Romans had used the North Sea to project power onto Britain's shores. The Angles and Saxons had crossed it to found new kingdoms. The Vikings had weaponized its accessibility to strike where defenders were unprepared. The Hanseatic merchants had turned its fish stocks and coastal routes into commercial empires. The Dutch and the English had fought each other across it 3 times to determine which mercantile system would dominate the world's trade. In every case, the fundamental question was the same. Who controls this sea, and what does that control allow them to do? By 1916, the answer to that question was being computed not in terms of maneuverability and wind direction, but in terms of dreadnought tonnage, industrial output, and the capacity to maintain an economic blockade across 2 years of total war. The technology had transformed beyond recognition. The stakes, national survival, economic dominance, the ability to project power outward while denying it to rivals, were almost exactly what they had always been. The High Sea Fleet never seriously challenged British dominance of the North Sea again. Germany's admirals understood, after Jutland, that the arithmetic would not improve for them. Britain's North Sea mastery held until the armistice of November 1918. It was a victory won not in a single afternoon's fighting, but in the Scottish shipyards, the Admiralty's planning rooms, and the grey, cold waters north of Denmark, where 2 industrial civilizations had finally measured themselves against each other, and one had simply refused to yield the sea. For most of the 20th century, the North Sea's economic identity rested on the same foundations it had occupied for centuries: fish, trade routes, and the strategic value of whoever could put warships on its surface. Then, in the 1960s, something changed that had nothing to do with fleets or fishing nets. Geologists began confirming what exploratory drilling had been suggesting for years. Beneath that grey, cold, turbulent water lay one of the most significant hydrocarbon deposits in the world. The sea that had made kingdoms, launched raids, and determined the outcome of a world war was about to reinvent itself entirely. The first major natural gas discoveries came in the early 1960s, and by the middle of that decade the race to understand what exactly lay beneath the continental shelf was well underway. The UK government moved quickly to establish its legal claim to the seabed under international frameworks, and so did Norway, Denmark and the Netherlands, each one eyeing the same geological formations from different national coastlines. What followed was one of the more remarkable economic transformations in modern European history. Within a generation, a sea known primarily for its herring stocks and its tendency to sink vessels in winter storms became the engine of a fiscal revolution. Commercial oil production from the UK sector began in 1975, and its effects on the British economy were almost immediately visible and, depending on your perspective, either fortunate or deeply complicated. By 1980, working from figures that the Bank of England itself placed before Parliament, North Sea oil was contributing roughly 3% to the UK's national income. That figure sounds modest until you consider what it represented in practice. A flood of revenue arriving at exactly the moment when the British economy was under severe structural strain. A balance of payments problem that had haunted successive governments, now partially offset by the simple fact that the country was pumping oil from its own territorial waters. The same Bank of England analysis estimated that the oil sector's contribution to export volumes had boosted the relevant measure of the balance of payments by something in the order of 12%. For a country that had spent much of the post-war decades negotiating with the International Monetary Fund and managing sterling crises, that was a significant shift in the underlying arithmetic. By the mid-1980s, the picture had sharpened further. The sector was delivering around £6 billion of annual revenue to the British Treasury, figures equivalent to somewhere between 4 and 5% of national income, depending on the methodology and the year in question. That caveat matters because the exact contribution varied with oil prices, production levels, and the particular accounting frameworks applied by different analysts. The Bank of England's quarterly bulletin calculations, the industry's own projections, and later independent reviews did not always agree on the precise share, but the broad direction was unmistakable. The United Kingdom had become for a period a net oil exporter, a status that would have seemed almost fantastical to any Treasury official working in the 1960s. The trade balance improved, the pound strengthened, the government found itself with a revenue stream that did not depend on income tax or economic growth, but on the geological accident that the right kind of rock had formed under British-administered waters 60 million years ago. Production built steadily through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, with an early peak in monthly output reached in 1985. That peak was eventually surpassed as new fields came online, and by 1999 the North Sea as a whole was producing approximately 128 million tonnes of oil per year, roughly 6 million barrels a day, representing the apex of a decades-long extraction curve. What came after that was a gradual decline that no amount of new drilling technology could entirely arrest, as the largest and most accessible fields began to exhaust themselves. The question of how much the North Sea actually contains, and contained, has never had a clean answer. Total oil extracted from the UK sector up to 2014 stood at around 42 billion barrels, a figure that represents a more or less settled historical record. But estimates of remaining reserves and projections of what the basin's ultimate total recovery might reach have varied so dramatically that the range itself tells you something important about the uncertainty involved. Depending on the source, government bodies, industry consortia, independent geological surveys, figures for remaining recoverable reserves have been quoted anywhere from 12 billion barrels at the conservative end to more than 70 billion at the optimistic end, with a central estimate somewhere around 24 billion barrels regarded by many analysts as the most defensible single number. The spread between those figures is not a rounding error. It reflects genuine uncertainty about what technology will make economically viable in the future, how oil prices will move, and how much marginal extraction from declining fields will ultimately be attempted. Any account of North Sea oil that presents a single definitive reserve figure with confidence is probably overstating what is actually known. What is not in dispute is the strategic transformation that oil imposed on the states surrounding the sea. For the United Kingdom, the implications reached far beyond revenue statistics. North Sea production gave successive governments room to manoeuvre that they would not otherwise have had. The Thatcher government's fiscal policies in the early 1980s, the willingness to tolerate unemployment, to push through structural economic changes that imposed severe short-term costs, were financially sustainable, in part because the oil revenues were flowing into the Treasury at a rate that offset some of the damage. Whether that windfall was used wisely is a question British economists and historians have been arguing about for decades. Norway, whose government channeled its North Sea revenues into a sovereign wealth fund that would become one of the largest in the world, offers an instructive comparison. The UK spent much of its oil revenue on current expenditure. The long-term implications of that choice are still being debated. For Denmark and the Netherlands, the calculus was different, but the fundamental dynamic was the same. access to North Sea hydrocarbons gave smaller economies leverage and revenue that their geographic position and industrial base could not have generated otherwise. The Dutch sector, in particular, had been significant since the large Groningen gas field was discovered in the early 1960s, providing cheap energy that underpinned Dutch industrial competitiveness for years, even as the so-called Dutch disease, the way resource revenues can crowd out other export industries by driving up the currency, became a term of art in economics. The North Sea had, over roughly 2 decades, accomplished something that centuries of fish and trade and naval warfare never quite managed. It had restructured the underlying fiscal architecture of its surrounding states. The water that had carried Viking longships and Dutch herring busses and British dreadnoughts was now delivering something invisible and arguably more powerful than any of them. The energy locked in ancient organic matter, pressurized over geological time, and extracted at a rate that governments, industries and workers were only beginning to understand came with its own particular and sometimes devastating costs. Those costs became impossible to ignore on the night of 6 July 1988. Piper Alpha sat approximately 120 miles northeast of Aberdeen, a fixed platform rising out of the North Sea in conditions that were, by the standards of that particular stretch of water, unremarkable. On board that evening were 228 workers, engineers, drillers, maintenance crews, men in the middle of ordinary 12-hour shifts doing the work that kept the oil moving. What followed in the space of a few hours was the deadliest offshore oil disaster in recorded history. By the time it was over, 167 of those men were dead. The sequence of events that produced the catastrophe was, in retrospect, a masterclass in how industrial disasters actually happen, not through a single catastrophic failure, but through a cascade of smaller problems that, individually, might each have been managed or survived, and together could not be. It began with a condensate pump. Maintenance work had been carried out on its pressure relief valve during the preceding shift, and the valve had been removed. The work was incomplete. A permit was in place documenting this, but when the shift changed, the documentation did not travel clearly from one team to the next. Communication broke down at the exact moment when it most needed to hold. When operators, unaware of the pump's condition, attempted to bring it online, condensate gas leaked and ignited. The first explosion tore through the platform at just after 10 in the evening. What happened next reflected failures of a different kind. The platform's automatic fire suppression system had been switched to manual, standard practice when divers were working in the water nearby, to prevent it from accidentally activating around them. It did not activate. The fire spread. 2 neighbouring platforms, connected to Piper Alpha by pipelines, continued pumping oil and gas into the burning installation because no one gave the order to shut them down, because the command and control structure for making that decision under those circumstances had never been adequately tested or defined. Pipeline ruptures followed. A second, far more powerful explosion destroyed much of the platform structure. Men who had retreated to the fireproofed accommodation block, following the emergency procedures they had been taught, found themselves trapped inside a burning platform with no way out. The module that was supposed to protect them became, in those circumstances, a death trap. The scale of the economic disruption made clear just how much weight had been resting on that single structure. Piper Alpha had been producing more than 300,000 barrels of oil per day at the time of the disaster, roughly 10% of the United Kingdom's total offshore output. Its sudden destruction sent a visible shock through production figures and through the sector's finances. The estimated financial loss to the industry ran to approximately £2 billion, equivalent to around $5 billion at the time. For a sector that had spent 2 decades becoming structurally important to the British economy, it was a brutal demonstration of concentration risk. too much output flowing through too few points of failure, in conditions where the consequences of getting something wrong were measured not just in balance sheets but in lives. The public inquiry that followed was led by Lord Cullen, and what it produced, published in 1990 after forensic examination of every element of the disaster, was one of the most thorough and unsparing analyses of industrial failure that British regulatory history has seen. Cullen's inquiry identified the missing pressure relief valve. It identified the failed permit-to-work procedures. It identified the breakdown in shift communication. But it went further than the immediate mechanics of the night itself, examining the broader culture in which those failures had been allowed to take root. What the inquiry found was an industry that had grown rapidly, under considerable commercial pressure, in an operating environment so novel and so physically hostile that safety thinking had not kept pace with the rate of expansion. The regulations that existed were outdated. The oversight structure was fragmented between different government bodies whose responsibilities overlapped in ways that left gaps. The safety culture on individual platforms varied enormously and was never systematically verified by any external body with the authority to demand improvement. The 106 recommendations that emerged from the Cullen inquiry became the foundation for a comprehensive regulatory overhaul. The Offshore Installations Safety Case, Regulations 1992, alongside the Offshore Safety Act of the same year, fundamentally restructured how the industry was required to operate. The central concept was the safety case, a detailed mandatory document that every offshore installation was now required to produce, demonstrating not just that it complied with specific technical standards, but that it had systematically identified its own risks and put in place coherent management systems to control them. This was a shift in regulatory philosophy as much as regulatory content. Instead of a checklist of requirements that an operator could satisfy and then set aside, the safety case demanded ongoing engagement, regular review, independent verification, demonstrated competence at every level of the organisation. The Health and Safety Executive was given consolidated authority over offshore safety, ending the jurisdictional confusion that had contributed to the inadequate oversight of the pre-Piper Alpha era. Emergency response procedures were overhauled and made subject to regular drills. Permit-to-work systems were modernised and standardised. The principle that safety management could be delegated informally and assumed to function without external scrutiny was simply abolished. The industry that emerged from those reforms was measurably different from the one that had existed on 5 July 1988. Accident rates fell. Near-miss reporting increased, because workers now had clearer assurances that raising concerns would not cost them their jobs. The safety case model was eventually adopted in offshore jurisdictions beyond the United Kingdom, including Norway and Australia, and elements of it influenced the international regulatory conversations that followed later disasters in other parts of the world. But it is worth holding on to the fact that 167 men had to die before any of that happened. The North Sea's oil wealth had been flowing for more than a decade before Piper Alpha. The risks inherent in building complex industrial infrastructure on unstable platforms in one of the world's most treacherous bodies of water had been understood at some level by everyone involved. The pressure to produce, the commercial incentives, the government's reliance on the revenue, the industry's confidence in its own capabilities, had all pushed in the direction of accepting those risks rather than systematically interrogating them. What Piper Alpha revealed was not that the North Sea was uniquely dangerous, but that its dangers had been underestimated and undermanaged, and that the cost of that misjudgment fell, as it always does, on the people doing the work closest to the hazard. The wealth was real. The transformation it brought to British, Dutch and Danish fiscal life was real. But the sea had never offered its resources for free, and after July 1988, no one working above those waters, or making decisions about them from an office on shore could reasonably pretend otherwise. The lesson of Piper Alpha was not only about safety, it was about the limits of treating an ancient, interconnected body of water as a resource to be drawn down without a corresponding framework of stewardship. And as the 20th century closed and the 21st opened, it became increasingly clear that the North Sea was presenting that challenge on every front simultaneously: fishing, shipping, energy, ecology, and that no single nation standing alone had either the leverage or the knowledge to manage it alone. The sea itself had not changed. What had changed was the density of competing claims upon it. By the early decades of the 21st century, the North Sea was one of the most heavily used stretches of water on the planet. Shipping lanes converged across it, carrying freight measured in billions of tons. EU ports alone moved approximately 3.4 billion tons of cargo in 2023, much of it transiting through or around North Sea corridors. Beneath the surface, pipelines and cables crossed in every direction, carrying oil, gas, and data. On the surface, fishing vessels from 5 or 6 nations worked the same grounds their predecessors had worked for centuries. Offshore, wind turbines were rising in arrays that would have been inconceivable a generation earlier. And below all of it, fish populations, seabird colonies, seal haulouts, and complex benthic ecosystems were trying to persist inside a system under continuous pressure from all directions at once. Managing that pressure required governance structures of a kind the sea had never seen before. Not the bilateral agreements of medieval fish merchants, not the prize courts of rival admiralties, but multilateral frameworks capable of coordinating extraction, transportation, protection, and planning across jurisdictions simultaneously. Fisheries presented perhaps the oldest version of this challenge. The collapse of North Sea cod stocks in the late 20th century, a slow-motion disaster that unfolded over decades of overfishing, had made brutally clear what happened when competitive extraction operated without enforceable limits. The EU Common Fisheries Policy emerged as the primary instrument for imposing those limits, setting total allowable catches for key stocks and dividing access among member states according to negotiated quotas. The system was imperfect, contentious, and regularly revised under pressure from both fishing industries and marine scientists. But in 2023, a trilateral agreement between the EU, the United Kingdom, and Norway, the 3 major powers over North Sea waters, set a total allowable catch of 915,000 tonnes for key demersal stocks, with the EU receiving a cod quota of around 415,000 tonnes, and area closures maintained to protect recovering cod populations. The fact that those 3 parties, with their long and often adversarial history of competing over the same waters, could sit down and negotiate that agreement at all, said something about how much the logic of the sea had shifted. Competition had not disappeared, but it was now embedded inside a framework of cooperation that neither side could simply walk away from without damaging itself. The Wadden Sea told a different kind of story, one about what happened when ecological value is placed explicitly at the centre of governance rather than at its margins. Stretching along the southern edge of the North Sea from the Netherlands through Germany and into Denmark, the Wadden Sea is one of the largest intertidal systems on Earth. It's a staging post for millions of migratory birds, a nursery ground for juvenile fish, a carbon sink, a flood buffer, and a landscape of extraordinary biological complexity, shaped by the same tidal rhythms that have scoured those shallows since long before any of the surrounding nations existed. UNESCO recognized its World Heritage status precisely because of that ecological significance, and the 3 bordering countries have maintained a system of joint management through successive declarations and conferences. In May 2023, Denmark, Germany and the Netherlands signed the Wilhelmshaven Declaration, reaffirming their commitment to trilateral protection and conservation beyond the 2022 conference cycle. That a strip of tidal mudflat and salt marsh could anchor an ongoing diplomatic agreement between three sovereign states was, looked at one way, a remarkable demonstration of how far ideas about the value of natural systems had travelled since the era when every marsh was simply something to drain. Maritime safety, the lesson the North Sea had delivered most violently through Piper Alpha, and through the hundreds of smaller disasters that the historical record had accumulated before and after it, now had its own transnational architecture. The European Maritime Safety Agency, EMSA, coordinated environmental monitoring and risk reduction across member state waters, deploying resources that would have seemed like science fiction to the men fighting fires on Piper Alpha in 1988. Since April 2023, EMSA had operated a remotely piloted aircraft system, an Aeroson drone with 10 hours of endurance, equipped with optical and infrared sensors and AIS reception, over the North Sea, providing live data to detect oil spills, identify drifting hazards, and support Coast Guard operations, including those of the Danish maritime authorities. The same stretch of sea that had once been readable only by those physically present on it, who navigated by dead reckoning and the colour of the water, was now under continuous electronic surveillance from above. Beneath all of these specific frameworks lay a deeper structural challenge: how to reconcile uses that were not simply different but often geometrically incompatible. A wind farm requires space. So does a shipping lane, so does a protected trawl-free zone, so does a pipeline corridor, so does a migratory bird flyway. The Interreg-funded Norsaic project, running from 2023 to 2026 with a combined budget of nearly €2.7 million, was attempting to address exactly this problem through transnational maritime spatial planning, developing frameworks that could map competing uses across national boundaries and build in climate adaptation alongside economic activity. The North Sea's Energy Cooperation had set a collective offshore wind target of 260 gigawatts by 2050, representing around 85% of the EU's total offshore wind goal, with 120 gigawatts aimed for by 2030. The sea that had once powered Europe's fishing fleets, and then its oil economy, was now being asked to power its electrical grid. What all of this reflects is something that the North Sea's history has always demonstrated. Though the contemporary moment makes it unusually visible, this is not a passive space through which human history has moved. It is a system with its own logic, its own limits, and its own capacity to punish the failure to understand those limits. Every empire that tried to dominate it, Roman, Hanseatic, Dutch, British, eventually encountered the point at which the sea's nature resisted their ambitions. Every industry that treated its resources as inexhaustible, the herring merchants, the whaling captains, the oil companies, eventually confronted the arithmetic of depletion. The states that shaped themselves around these waters, England, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, did so through centuries of learning how the sea worked and calibrating their ambitions accordingly. Not always wisely, not without catastrophic error, but repeatedly and with growing sophistication. The governance frameworks of the 21st century are the latest iteration of that calibration. They're incomplete, contested, and under pressure from every direction. But they represent something the North Sea has been requiring of its human neighbours since the first hunters crossed the Doggerland plain. Not mastery, but adaptation. Not extraction without limit, but a reckoning with the fact that the sea will outlast every arrangement made upon it. And the only question is whether those arrangements are intelligent enough to deserve to last. There is a temptation, at the end of a long history, to treat the sea as a backdrop, a stage on which human drama played out cold and indifferent. But the North Sea was never that. It was an actor. It shaped what was possible, what was profitable, what was dangerous, and what endured. And the three nations most formed by its influence, England, Denmark, and the Netherlands, bear its marks at the deepest levels of their identities. England's very name comes from it. The Angles, who gave their name to Anjuln, a small peninsula on the Danish-German border, crossed the North Sea and planted themselves in a land that became, over generations, England. They were followed by Saxons from the continental coast and Jutes from the Danish peninsula. What that migration produced was not simply a new population, but a new language, a new legal culture, and a new political imagination that would eventually reach around the world. None of it happens without a narrow sea passable enough to cross but wide enough to defend. The channel that allowed migration also eventually allowed identity. A world separated just enough from the continent to develop its own logic. Denmark's story runs in a parallel groove. The same sea that brought Germanic settlers to Britain became, 3 centuries later, the highway for Danish longships. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 was not just a violent shock to an island monastery. It was the first announcement of a 2-century campaign that would eventually produce the Danelaw, reshape northern England's place names and legal customs, and bind Danish political ambition to English soil. The North Sea was Denmark's projection of power, its economic lifeline, and the arena in which Danish kings measured themselves against the wider world. The Netherlands took a different lesson from the same water. Where the English and Danes found in the North Sea a crossing, the Dutch found a workshop. The herring bus, the fleet, the network of coastal and deep-sea trading relationships, these were Dutch innovations built on a Dutch understanding that the sea, managed with sufficient intelligence and organisation, was not a hazard to be survived, but a source of wealth to be systematically exploited. The Dutch Golden Age was financed in significant part by fish pulled from North Sea waters and goods moved across them. When Dutch and English interests eventually collided in 3 naval wars between 1652 and 1674, what was being fought over was not simply territory, but the right to define the terms of a maritime economy that the North Sea had made possible. Through all of these transformations, one pattern repeats with striking consistency. The sea changed role entirely depending on who was looking at it and when. Land bridge, migration corridor, fishing ground, trading route, naval battleground, energy basin. Each of those roles carried the same dual character, enormous opportunity and enormous risk running together in the same cold water. The herring trade made the Dutch rich, and then collapsed under overfishing. The oil fields added roughly 3% to British GDP at their peak in the early 1980s, and then Piper Alpha burned in the dark in 1988, and 167 men died within sight of that wealth. The sea offered, and the sea took back, and the nations built around it had to learn that equation over and over, each generation paying the tuition again. What is perhaps most striking, looking across the full arc of that history, is how consistently these nations underestimated the sea's capacity to resist. Every power that believed it had finally mastered the North Sea, by military dominance, commercial organisation, or technological sophistication, eventually discovered otherwise. The Romans withdrew. The Hanseatic League dissolved. The Dutch Republic conceded naval supremacy. Britain's oil revenues proved finite. The sea continued on its own terms regardless. And yet the story is not one of futility. The cultures that formed along these shores did so through a sustained engagement with something genuinely difficult, genuinely dangerous, and genuinely generative. The institutional creativity of the Dutch, the maritime tenacity of the English, the seafaring ambition of the Danes, these were not coincidences of geography. They were responses to what the North Sea demanded of the people living beside it. This was never peripheral water. It sat at the centre of Northern Europe's political, economic and cultural development for millennia, from the moment the first hunters walked its sunken plains to the present, when its winds are being harnessed to power the continent's electrical grid. The cold water made things. It made nations, it made languages, it made empires and ended them. It made wealth and extracted a price for it. That is what the North Sea made, and the making is not finished.